Kansas, 1886. The well sat 40 yards from the house, ringed with fieldstone her father had hauled up from the creek bed, one wagon load at a time, the summer before he died. Delphine Whitfield still put her hand on that stone every morning before she touched anything else, the way another woman might touch a photograph or a folded letter. It was warm from the sun by noon and cold as a doorknob at dawn. And either way, it felt like the one thing in the world that hadn't changed since she was 19, and watched him drive the last iron rod into the ground and say, "There, right there, that's where the water wants to be." Nobody had believed him then either. She was 26 now, and she ran the homestead alone, had run it alone for 3 years, ever since the fever took him in a single hard week in the fall. She rose before light, fed the stock, mended fence with her own 2 hands because there was no one else to mend it, and carried water up from the well in a yoke across her shoulders until the muscle there had gone hard and permanent, a shape her mother would not have recognized. The neighbors called her capable when they were being kind, and called her something else when they thought she couldn't hear them. A woman alone on 160 acres was, to most of Larkspur Hollow, a problem waiting for a solution, and the solution they had in mind for her did not involve her keeping the land. I want to stop here for just a moment because I know some of you watching tonight understand exactly what that kind of solitude costs, even if your circumstances look nothing like Delphine's. This story has already found its way to listeners in Brazil, in Nigeria, in the Philippines, in South Africa, in towns and cities I will never see. And if you are one of them tonight, hearing this for the first time, I am glad you are here. This channel is still growing, and every person who stays makes it a little more possible to keep telling stories like this one. If it means something to you, take a moment and subscribe before you go. It helps more than you would guess, and it means we get to keep meeting like this. Now let's get back, because Delphine had a well nobody believed in, and a summer coming that was about to prove her right. Her father, Ezra Whitfield, had been what some folks in the county called a water witch, though he never used the word himself. He read land the way other men read weather, by instinct built on decades of walking it, watching where the grass stayed green a week longer than it should, where the frost lifted first in spring, where the deer lingered at dusk instead of moving on. He had come west from Ohio with nothing but a wagon and a forked willow branch he cut fresh every year, and he had found water for half the county at one time or another, for a jar of preserves or a day's labor in return, never for money, because he said water wasn't the kind of thing a decent man charged his neighbors for. But when it came to his own land, the land along Coldwater Creek that everyone said was cursed with a bed that ran dry 2 summers out of 5, he had walked past 3 spots the other diggers favored and stopped at a low rise nobody would have chosen, 40 yards back from the creek itself, in ground that looked, to any ordinary eye, exactly like the ground around it. The men who'd come to help him dig had laughed about it over supper for years afterward. The story softened by time into something almost affectionate. Ezra Whitfield, they'd say, shaking their heads, dug his well in the one place in the county with no earthly reason to have water, and somehow it never once ran dry, not through the drought of '79, not through the hard winter after. Delphine had stood beside him the whole 2 weeks it took to dig it, hauling buckets of loose earth up on a rope, and she had watched his face when the diggers hit the water table nearly 30 feet down, far deeper than anyone expected for a hole in the middle of dry Kansas prairie. He hadn't smiled the way another man might have. He'd just nodded, like a man confirming something he'd already known in his bones, and put his palm flat against the fresh stone they were setting around the rim, the same way she did now, 3 years after he was gone. She was 17 that summer, old enough to understand what he was teaching her, even though he never called it teaching. He showed her how to read the grass and the frost and the deer trails. He showed her how to hold the willow rod loose in her hands, not gripping it, letting it find its own pull. He told her that most men who called themselves diviners were doing something closer to guessing, dressed up in ceremony to make the guessing look like magic. But that underneath the ceremony, if you paid close enough attention to land for long enough years, you could learn to read it the way a sailor reads the sky before a storm. It isn't magic, Del, he told her once. "It's just paying attention harder and longer than anybody else is willing to." She had believed him then. She still believed him now, on the mornings when the whole rest of the county seemed determined to prove otherwise. The trouble had started, as trouble in Larkspur Hollow so often did, with Silas Rourke. Rourke ran the largest cattle operation east of the county line, close to 9,000 acres, built up over 20 years through a combination of hard work, sharp dealing, and a willingness to buy out any smaller outfit unlucky enough to hit a bad season at the same time its note came due. He was not, by most accounts, a cruel man, not in the way villains are cruel in stories told to frighten children. He believed, with the total conviction of a man who has never once had to doubt himself, that the land around Larkspur Hollow was meant to belong to serious operators, men with capital and cattle and the patience to build something lasting, and that everyone else was simply occupying ground that would eventually, inevitably, come to him. He had said as much to Delphine's father once, years back, over a fence line, and Ezra had laughed in his face and told him the Whitfield land wasn't for sale at any price, then or ever. Rourke had not forgotten the laugh. When Ezra died and left the homestead to his only child, a young unmarried woman with no brothers and no husband to run the place for her, Rourke had assumed, reasonably enough by the standards of most men in that county, that the land would come to him within a season or two, the way ripe fruit comes down off a branch on its own. He had even sent a man to make her an offer within a month of the funeral, a fair offer by the numbers, generous even, meant to spare a grieving young woman the burden of 160 acres she surely couldn't manage alone. Delphine had thanked the man for coming and told him the land wasn't for sale, then or ever, in words close enough to her father's that the messenger had gone back to Rourke looking faintly unsettled. That had been 3 years ago. She had proven, season after season, that she could run the place. Her herd was small but healthy. Her fences held. Her well never failed her, not once, not even in the dry summer of '84, when half the wells in the county dropped low enough to worry every farmer along the creek. She had built, out of stubbornness and her father's teaching and her own 2 calloused hands, something that worked, and Rourke had watched it work with the particular, quiet resentment of a man who cannot stand to be wrong about anything, least of all, a woman he had already decided was a temporary occupant of land he considered rightfully his. This is the 3rd story I've told on this channel, and if it's speaking to you the way I hope it is, I'd love it if you'd take a second to comment below. I always like knowing where in the world this finds you and what you're doing while you listen tonight, whether you've got your hands busy with something or you're just sitting still for a few minutes to yourself. It genuinely helps other people find their way to stories like this one when you leave a word or two, and it means a great deal to know these stories are traveling somewhere real. Now let's get back to Delphine, because the summer of '86 was about to test every bit of what she'd built. The trouble, when it finally came the way trouble in farm country usually does, slow at first, and then all at once. The spring rains had been thinner than anyone liked to say out loud, and by the middle of June, Coldwater Creek, never a strong stream in the best of years, had shrunk to a trickle of brown water winding between cracked mud banks. By July, it had stopped running altogether, leaving behind a dry bed of pale gray clay that split into hexagonal plates under the relentless sun, the kind of drought Kansas farmers had a dozen grim names for and no real defense against. Wells across the county began to fail within weeks of each other. The Hutchins place went dry first, then the Coopers. Then, to the disbelief of half the town, even Rourke's own operation felt the pinch, his largest stock tank dropping low enough that he had to start hauling water in barrels from the county seat, 12 miles each way, an expense and an indignity he bore with visibly thinning patience. Delphine's well did not fail. It dropped some, the way it always did in a dry year, the water table sinking a few feet lower than usual by August. But it never came close to running dry, never gave her a morning without water for the stock and the garden and her own 2 hands. She had known it wouldn't, in the way she'd known it every dry summer since her father dug it. But knowing it herself and having the rest of Larkspur Hollow finally see it were two very different things, and by late July, they were starting to see it. Word travels fast in small places, faster than a dry creek bed, and it wasn't long before people who had spent 3 years calling her the addled water witch's daughter behind cupped hands were showing up at her gate with empty barrels and careful, apologetic faces, asking if she might spare a little water, just enough to see a family through until the rains came back. She said yes every time. It never once occurred to her to say anything else. Her father hadn't charged his neighbors for water, and neither would she, whatever it cost her in hauled buckets and long afternoons at the well rope, whatever satisfaction she might privately have felt, and did feel, watching the same men who'd laughed about her father over supper stand at her gate with their hats in their hands. It was somewhere in the middle of that long, dry stretch that Amos Kestrel first rode onto the Whitfield land. And Delphine, hauling a bucket up from the well with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and dust in her hair, did not look up from her work to greet him the way most young women in the county might have. He was a surveyor, sent out by the railroad company that had been quietly buying up rights of way through the county for the better part of a year, mapping a possible spur line that would run somewhere near Coldwater Creek if the terrain cooperated. He was perhaps 30, sun-weathered in the way of a man who'd spent most of his working life outdoors, with the kind of quiet, watchful patience that came, she would learn later, from years of reading unfamiliar ground for a living. He introduced himself politely from the saddle, explained his business, and asked, almost as an afterthought, why her well hadn't gone dry when every other well within 5 miles had. Nobody had asked her that question in 3 years. Most people asked how she was managing or whether she'd thought any more about selling, or, more rarely and more kindly, whether she needed help. Nobody had simply asked how the well worked, as though the answer might actually be worth hearing. She told him. She told him about the willow rod and the grass that stayed green a week longer and the frost that lifted first, about the deer trails and the low rise nobody else had wanted to dig, about her father's flat, unsurprised nod when the water came in 30 feet down. She watched his face while she talked, waiting for the polite, humoring look she'd gotten used to from most men in the county. The look that said, "Isn't that a charming old story?" And it didn't come. Instead, he dismounted, walked the rise slowly with his eyes on the ground the way she did, and said, after a long, quiet minute, that he'd surveyed enough land to know most men who claimed to read it that way were dressing up guesswork, but that this didn't look like guesswork to him. It looked like a man who'd actually understood the ground. It was the first time in 3 years anyone outside her own memory had said her father was right about anything. Most surveyors I know would call that superstition and move on, she said, testing him a little, the way she'd learned to test most men who came through the gate with an easy compliment ready on their tongue. Most surveyors I know haven't spent 10 years reading ground for a living, he answered, not offended, just matter of fact about it. Superstition doesn't hold up under a transit and a set of elevation marks. What your father did holds up. I checked the rise myself while you were talking. It sits half a foot higher than the surrounding grade, just enough to catch runoff nobody else would notice catching. That's not luck. That's a man who spent years watching this exact piece of ground before he ever picked up a shovel. She hadn't expected to be understood so plainly, and it unsettled her more than any flattery could have. He came back the following week under the pretense of finishing his survey, and again the week after that. And by the third visit, neither of them bothered pretending the survey required quite that much attention. He helped her mend a stretch of fence one afternoon without being asked, working alongside her in a silence that felt easier than most conversation. And when she finally asked him, half joking, whether the railroad paid him to fix other people's fences, he told her, without quite meeting her eyes, that he'd rather be useful than idle, and that he hadn't minded the company either. She did not let herself think too hard about what she felt watching him work her land like it mattered to him. She had learned the hard way 3 years back that wanting things you couldn't keep only made the losing of them worse, and a railroad surveyor was, by definition, a man passing through. Still, there were evenings that summer when she caught herself listening for hoofbeats on the road before she'd admit to herself she was listening at all, and mornings when she found some reason to walk the fence line nearest the road a little earlier than the work strictly required. She said nothing of it to anyone. There was no one left to say it to, no mother, no sister, only the well and the stock and her own private, careful hope, which she guarded the way she guarded everything else she valued, quietly and close to the chest. One evening, mending harness leather on the porch, while Amos worked a burr out of his gelding's mane nearby, she asked him outright why a man with steady railroad wages and no land of his own kept finding reasons to linger on hers. He set the comb down before he answered, which she noticed, because most men answered too quickly to have thought about it at all. "I've surveyed a lot of ground that nobody loved," he said. "Ground bought and sold a dozen times by men who never once walked it themselves, never learned where the water sat or where the frost came late. This is the first piece of Kansas I've come across where somebody actually knows it, the way you'd know a person. I didn't expect that to matter to me as much as it does." "That's the land you're answering for," she said. "Not me." "Maybe," he said, and looked at her steady enough that she understood he meant otherwise, though neither of them said so directly. Not yet. Not with the whole dry summer and Rourke's grudge still ahead of them. Silas Rourke did not care for any of this, though it took him a while to say so directly. What he cared about, more urgently, was the drought, which by August had become the worst the county had seen in a decade, and the growing, humiliating fact that a young unmarried woman running 160 acres alone had somehow outlasted his 9,000. He had tried quietly at first to buy water rights along Coldwater Creek from every landholder who touched it, framing it as a neighborly arrangement to see the whole county through the dry spell, and most of the smaller farmers, desperate enough, had signed. Delphine had not. She had told his man, politely but without hesitation, that her well wasn't part of any creek arrangement, since it had never depended on the creek in the first place, and that she'd go on sharing water freely with any neighbor who asked her directly, the way she always had, but that she wouldn't sign her father's well over to Silas Rourke's control for any price he cared to name. Rourke's response arrived less than a week later, in the form of a lawyer's letter. The letter cited an old, half-forgotten county water ordinance from the territorial days, one that gave landholders adjacent to a named waterway certain rights over wells drawing from the same underground source, and claimed on Rourke's behalf that the Whitfield well, being within a certain distance of Coldwater Creek, fell under that ordinance and could therefore be subject to a shared water allocation determined by the largest adjacent landholder, namely Rourke himself. It was a stretch of a claim, resting on a law nobody had invoked in 30 years, but it was the kind of stretch a man with money for lawyers and a judge he golfed with could make sound a good deal more solid than it was. And everyone in the county, Delphine included, understood exactly what it really meant. Rourke could not simply take her land, not outright, not without cause. But if he could tie up her well in a legal fight long enough, drain her resources and her patience and her standing with a county court that leaned toward the man with the bigger operation, he might yet force her into exactly the kind of sale she'd refused 3 years running. She read the letter twice at her kitchen table, alone, by lamplight, and did not cry, though she wanted to. She thought about her father's hand on the fresh stone, 30 feet above water nobody else believed was there, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had not spent 3 years hauling buckets and mending fence and burying a father alone, just to hand the one thing he'd truly given her over to a man who'd laughed at him over a fence line. What are you doing right now, listening to this part of the story? I always find myself curious about that, whether you're sitting quietly with a cup of something warm, or working with your hands the way Delphine did most of her life, or just lying still in the dark, letting the story carry you somewhere else for a while. If any part of tonight's story has struck close to something in your own life, that particular feeling of being underestimated until the moment you absolutely can't be anymore, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. It helps other people feel less alone in that feeling too. Now let's get back, because Delphine wasn't about to let a lawyer's letter decide the fate of her father's well without a fight. She rode into the county seat the next morning and spent the better part of 2 days doing something she had never once done in 3 years of running the homestead alone, which was ask for help, not with the physical labor of the land, which she'd never shied from, but with the particular kind of fight that required a courthouse and a judge, and words she didn't fully understand yet. She found, to her surprise, that she was not without allies. The same neighbors who had once laughed at her father and later stood at her gate with their hats in their hands and empty barrels, now stood beside her at the county recorder's office, willing to testify, if it came to that the Whitfield well had never once drawn from Coldwater Creek's water table, that its depth and its location on the rise made it a wholly separate source, that they had watched Ezra Whitfield dig it themselves and knew exactly how far it sat from the creek's actual bed. Amos Kestrel, when he heard about the letter, did something that surprised her more than any of it. He rode straight to the county land office and requested the original survey maps from when the railroad had first mapped the region a decade earlier. Maps that showed, in precise, dispassionate government ink, the underground water table lines the railroad's own geologists had charted before laying any track. Those maps, it turned out, showed clearly that the rise where Ezra Whitfield had dug his well sat over a separate aquifer entirely, fed by an underground channel that had nothing to do with Coldwater Creek's surface flow, a fact the ordinance Rourke was leaning on had never anticipated because nobody in the territorial days had the means to map it. "It isn't magic," her father had told her once. "It's paying attention harder and longer than anybody else is willing to." And here, finally, was a stranger who had paid exactly that kind of attention, not for love of her, not yet, though she suspected by then it might come to that, but simply because the ground itself had told him a truth worth chasing down. The hearing, when it came, in late August, in a courthouse crowded with more of the county than Delphine had expected to see, did not go the way Rourke had planned. His lawyer argued the old ordinance with as much confidence as ever, but the survey maps, entered into the record by a railroad man with no reason to favor either side, spoke plainly enough that even a judge inclined toward the county's largest landholder couldn't argue past them. The Whitfield well drew from its own source. It had never been part of Coldwater Creek's water table, ordinance or no ordinance, and Rourke's claim, built on a technicality and a grudge 3 years old, collapsed under its own weight. Rourke's lawyer had tried, near the end, to argue that even if the well drew from a separate source, the county's interest in fair water distribution during an emergency drought ought to override a technical distinction between aquifers. A last, thin argument offered mostly because he had nothing sturdier left to offer. It was Amos who answered that one, called forward by Delphine's own counsel to speak to the survey maps, standing in front of a courtroom in his work clothes with dust still on his boots from the ride in. "I've mapped water tables across 4 counties for the railroad," he said, "and I can tell you plainly that what Mr. Rourke is calling an emergency measure would set every well owner in this county wondering whether their own water might be reassigned to whichever neighbor has the most cattle and the best lawyer. That's not fairness. That's just taking, dressed up to look neighborly." A murmur had gone through the courtroom at that, low and approving, and Rourke's lawyer had not tried the argument again. What undid him further in the eyes of the county was what happened after the ruling, when Delphine stood up, unbidden, in a courthouse gone quiet, and said, plainly, that she intended to keep sharing her well's water with any neighbor in need through the rest of the drought, the same as she had all summer, and that she hoped Mr. Rourke's own stock might see relief soon too. Drought being hard on every outfit in the county, large or small. It was not said with malice. It was said, if anything, with something close to her father's old flat generosity. Water isn't the kind of thing a decent man charges his neighbors for, and the plain grace of it, offered to the very man who'd tried to take her well from her, did more to shame Silas Rourke in that courthouse than any ruling could have. He did not apologize, not in words, not that day, but he did not trouble the Whitfield land again. And when his own herd came through the worst of the drought, partly on water hauled, at his own men's quiet arrangement, from a well he'd once tried to seize, He stopped telling the story of Ezra Whitfield's foolish well to anyone who'd listen, and the county, gradually, stopped telling it too. Except now the story had a different ending. Amos stayed through the end of that dry summer, and then through the fall, when the rains finally came back and Coldwater Creek ran again for the first time in months. And by then, it had become difficult for either of them to pretend the railroad's business required quite so much of his attention in Larkspur Hollow. He asked her one evening in October, sitting on the porch steps with the creek running audibly again in the distance for the first time in months, whether she thought a man who'd learned to read her land as carefully as he had might be permitted to stay and keep reading it alongside her for the rest of his life. And she said yes with far less hesitation than she'd expected of herself. 3 years a widow to nobody but her own grief and her own stubborn independence. 3 years later, the well still sat 40 yards from the house, ringed with the same fieldstone her father had hauled up from the creek, though the ring had been widened some to accommodate a second trough for the growing herd she and Amos ran together now. A herd built as much from her own hard-won knowledge of the land as from any capital he'd brought to the marriage. Their daughter, not yet 2, liked to be carried out to the well each morning and set down on the warm stone to watch the bucket come up, the way Delphine herself had once stood beside her own father and watched the same thing. Rourke's operation had recovered, in time, the way most operations in that country eventually did, and he and Delphine kept a distant, careful civility whenever their business crossed, the kind two people maintain when one of them has been proven wrong in front of an entire county and both of them know it. On quiet evenings, Delphine still put her palm flat against the wellstone before she touched anything else, the way she had at 19, at 26, and every age between and since, feeling the particular warmth or cold of it depending on the hour, and thinking each time of her father's voice telling her it wasn't magic, just paying attention harder and longer than anybody else was willing to. She had come to believe by then that the same was true of most things worth having, land and water and love alike, none of it magic, all of it built from a stubborn, patient willingness to look closer at what everyone else had already decided wasn't there. The county had mocked her father's well for a decade before it saved half the town in a single dry summer, and it had mocked his daughter for 3 years before it finally understood that the two of them had never once been foolish, only patient, in a world that mistook patience for foolishness, far too often for its own good. She still thought some nights that the truest inheritance her father had left her wasn't the well itself, or even the land around it, but the particular, quiet courage it took to trust your own careful reading of the world when everyone around you insists you must be wrong. It was a harder thing to dig up than water, and a longer thing to keep, but she had kept it through drought and doubt and one very long dry summer, and she meant to pass it on to her own daughter exactly the way it had been passed to her, one warm hand on cold stone at a time.